Good afternoon. My name is Vince Rock, Program Manager here at the American Brain Tumor Association. The ABTA is pleased to welcome you back to our webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Altering Metabolism for Brain Tumor Therapy, Food for Thought. Please note that all lines during our webinar today are muted. If you have a question you would like to ask, please type and submit it using the question box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Our presenters will answer questions at the end of the presentation. The webinar will be recorded. The recording will post to the ABTA's website on the webinars page shortly. Registered participants will receive a copy of the webinar in a follow-up email message tomorrow. In the next few days, you will receive an email asking you to take a brief survey to evaluate the webinar. Please take a few minutes to share your feedback, which is important to us as we plan for future webinars. I am delighted to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Adrienne Scheck and Leonora Renda. Dr. Adrienne C. Scheck is a senior research scientist in the Institute of Molecular Medicine, Phoenix Children's Hospital, and a research associate professor at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, Phoenix. Her laboratory is a leader in the study of the use of metabolic alteration through the use of a therapeutic ketogenic diet as an adjunct to the standard of care to improve survival and minimize side effects for patients with malignant brain tumors. She has recently relocated to Phoenix Children's Hospital and is now extending her research to pediatric brain tumors. Leonora Renda, MS, RDN, is the Manager of Nutritional Sciences, Dignity Health, Chandler Regional Medical Center, as well as maintaining a consulting business to help cancer patients who want to implement the ketogenic diet. Her background includes food service, public health, special needs nutrition, cancer, and metabolic nutrition. She developed and implemented the first folic acid nutrition and vitamin distribution statewide program in Arizona and was involved in developing and passing the Arizona School Nutrition Standards for grades K through 8. In her spare time, she teaches spin and yoga. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Scheck and Ms. Renda. You may now begin your presentation.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. So I'm going to get started here. First of all, disclosures and supports. Unfortunately, I have no stock or patent rights or anything, and Nutrition North America has been giving us KetoCal for our preclinical work, but they have nothing to say about the research or there's no intellectual property or anything like that going on. So there's something called the Warburg effect in cancer, and this was figured out by Otto Warburg back in 1924. And basically what that is that tumor cells generate energy from glucose using a method that cells normally only do when there isn't oxygen around. So even when there's oxygen around for tumor cells, they use something called aerobic glycolysis. And this actually gives the cell less ATP molecules, that's less energy molecules for each molecule of glucose. So it's pretty inefficient for getting energy. So for that reason, tumors need lots and lots of glucose. You might wonder why a tumor cell would do that. Well, it turns out that although they get a little bit less energy from the glucose, they get a lot of building blocks to make more cells. So the cancers are pretty happy, but they do need a lot of glucose. Well, in 2000, there was a paper that came out about the hallmarks of cancer, and metabolism was not on it. In 2011, that paper came out as a second version, and now metabolism actually hit the big time and is now considered one of the hallmarks of cancer, that metabolism in cancer cells is basically screwed up. So some people are saying cancer is a metabolic disease because its energetics are very important, the ability of a cell to get energy. That might be true, but in addition to these metabolic changes in cancer cells, there's lots of other changes. There's changes in the genes, there's changes in how the genes are used, and there's something called epigenetic changes, which are additional changes in how genes are used. There's a lot going on in cancer. So the way we look at it in our lab, and we think in cartoons, look at genetics and metabolism and epigenetics, you really can't separate them. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So basically, I kind of think of it this way. So you've got epigenetics, genetics, metabolism, cancer, they're all mixed up, interchanged, knotted together, it's pretty very hard to separate any one thing out and say that that's what's causing cancer. So in addition to that, tumors are heterogeneous, which is a very fancy name for different tumor cells have different genetics. And they're very unstable. As the cells divide, they actually change their genetics. So this is called a karyotype. It shows the chromosomes that are in a particular tumor cell. So here's one cancer cell, and you can see it's kind of, there should be 2 copies of everything. So it's missing one of those, it's missing one of those. Another cell from the same tumor in the same patient, okay? When you grow the cells in the lab, you can see different cells that look different, cells where the chromosomes are different, so that means the DNA is different in that particular cell. Here's another one. These cells also look different, and again, when you look at the chromosomes in one of these cells, they look different. Yet another one. This is work done by a colleague of mine, Dr. Joan Rankin-Shapiro, and a long time ago, she noticed that if you actually looked at the DNA of many cells from the same tumor, from the same person, there's a lot of differences. I think of cancer as the perfect storm. There's genetic issues, there's epigenetic issues, there's metabolic issues, but you can't really separate it. Everything sort of gets mixed up together. So how would you treat something that's like this? Not only is it really hard to pin down any particular cause, but these cells actually can change every time the tumor cell divides into 2 cells. So our answer to that sort of is kind of any way you can. You can target the cells that are growing really fast in the body. You can do that with radiation, with some chemotherapies. You can target molecular changes. People are looking at what changes are there in the DNA and trying to make targets to particularly get the cells that have those particular changes. You can try to get the immune system to fight the tumor, so-called immunotherapy. And then what we're going to talk about a little bit today, which is to target the weaknesses that are in these cells because their metabolism is really aberrant, or to use a scientific word, screwed up. So the fact that these tumors can keep changing their genetics in terms of each cell as it divides, and the fact that these tumors have many things going on, it's really pretty unlikely that any one mechanism in a tumor cell is going to cure a cancer. It's very unlikely that any one therapy will work on all cancers, and actually that's something that anybody who knows anyone who's had cancer has obviously seen. So the cool thing about the ketogenic diet, or what we call ketogenic therapy, is that it's pluripotent, which is a really fancy word for many potencies. It does many, many things. So the simple question that people started with was, if tumors need a lot of glucose, can you starve the tumors by reducing the glucose? That's where this whole thing kind of started. But normal cells also need glucose, and you don't want to starve the normal cells. Well, this is what's cool about the therapeutic ketogenic diet. It's very high fat, low carbohydrate, low protein. You're going to hear a lot about that from my colleague, Renda. It reduces glucose in the blood, and it increases something called blood ketones. And your normal cells can use ketones for energy just as well as they use glucose. It's a great energy source for the normal brain. So your normal cells can be pretty happy. And the idea is maybe your tumor cells will be unhappy. For those of you who have heard of caloric restriction or short-term fasting, that's kind of become popular lately. And in fact, the ketogenic diet really mimics these 2 things. So both of these things basically cause the same kinds of changes: reduction in blood glucose, increase in blood ketones. The whole idea of a therapeutic ketogenic diet has been used as a treatment for epilepsy in children where the children don't respond for drugs. So it's got a very long history of being used successfully. It's very successful in treating this, and it's safe. So the history is good. And we have found, and others have found, that it inhibits the growth of brain tumor in the laboratory. There's a number of laboratories that are doing this sort of work in various mouse models, in tumor cells that we grow in the lab. There are published human studies, so there are a few studies where some individual people have been published on because they've done so well, and of course anecdotal studies, and we all know if it's on Facebook, it must be true. So what is actually going on? What is the laboratory science for the use of a KD in brain tumor therapy? One of the problems with a lot of dietary therapies that are out there is you go online and you see a beautiful website that says to do all these things, use fruits and vegetables and make sure that there's no pesticides and all this other stuff. But then you look for the science behind it and there is absolutely none. And that, I think, makes some people very wary of that diet word for cancer. But in fact, there's a huge amount of laboratory science for the use of the ketogenic diet or ketones as a brain tumor therapy, not just from us, but from many other labs too. So just to bring everybody up to speed, when we talk about preclinical data, that means the work was done in a research laboratory, not in people. So you can have mouse models, you can have mouse tumor cells in mice, you can have human tumor cells in mice, and you can study the effects of the diet. I'm going to show you some data on that. You can grow tumor cells in the laboratory, and you can just dump ketones on the cells and see what happens. And you can also analyze tissue that we get from patients. And all of this can be done even before you start to get the patients doing it. So you can try to figure out, is it going to work? How is it going to work? And that gives you the data you need to go to the clinicians and say, try this in patients. So this is a very good experiment we did. We actually had cells that came from a human brain tumor. It was a very aggressive brain tumor. It was actually the 4th tumor that this patient had. And when we grew these cells in the lab, this is just the cell count. So this is when we did nothing in the black line. The red line was when we added chemotherapy, and this particular chemotherapy is a chemotherapy that this patient had received. These cells are from the 1980s. When we added ketones, you can see the growth of these tumor cells slowed down. When we added the ketones and the chemotherapy together, it wiped out the culture. The cells died. So that was enough to make us say, okay, yeah, we really want to study. So this is the designation of the cell line for anybody who's a scientist out there. One thing was we did not reduce the glucose. So we did this in the presence of a very high concentration of glucose because that's what these cells are grown in. And we added the ketones, beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate are 2 ketones that our body makes. And we added, like I said, we added a drug that this patient had actually seen. So this was very exciting to us because it told us that even in the presence of glucose, ketones are doing something. So we had to go into an animal model. I'm an animal lover. This is all done extremely humanely. So what we did is we took mouse tumor cells, mouse brain tumor cells. We edited the gene that makes fireflies glow. We stuck that into the cells. So now we have cells that glow like fireflies. And we actually have an instrument that can see this bioluminescence even without shaving the animal's head or doing anything. You just give the animal a little bit of isoflurane gas or anesthesia gas. You put it in this instrument. It sleeps, it's nice, it's dark, it's warm, and we can image the tumor and quantitatively see how this tumor is growing. And then when we're done, the animal's fine, comes up, goes back into its cage, starts to eat and run around. So what we did is we took these tumor cells. This is an immunocompetent model, which means the immune system of the mouse is completely intact because we're using mouse cells. So there won't be any rejection that you might get if you used human cells in an immune-competent animal. They're bioluminescent, like I said. We used a human formulation of a ketogenic diet called KetoCal to try to make it as close as possible to the human condition. This has a ratio of 4 parts fat to 1 part carb plus protein. And again, you'll hear more about that from my colleague, Renda. We just mixed it with water and threw it in the cage and let the animals eat as much as they wanted. So on day 0, we surgically implanted these cells into the animal's brain. We did a scan to see how big were the tumors on day 3. We randomized them to what treatment they were going to get, ketogenic diet versus standard diet. We checked ketone level and glucose level to make sure that the animals were indeed in ketosis. And then as soon as symptoms appear, the animals are humanely sacrificed. And this is what it looks like when the animal is imaged. She's asleep, and you can see this indication of the tumor growing. So this is what we did. This is what we found. So if you're not familiar with the Kaplan-Meier plot, which is this type of graph, all you have to know is the faster the line drops, the faster the animals are succumbing to their disease. So here's the standard diet, here's ketogenic diet. And it's very statistically significant increase in survival. When we added it to the current therapy used for adult brain tumors, which is temozolomide, again, standard diet, ketogenic diet. So strong improvement in survival. But what really kind of blew our minds was when we did it with radiation. So that's the radiation plus standard diet, and that's radiation plus ketogenic diet. The tumor disappeared in 9 of 11 animals. And the reason we know that is because we have this bioluminescent imaging. So we can actually see the tumor was there, and we can see that it disappeared. What was really cool is on day 101, because we were scanning every 3 days, we switched the animals that had survived back to standard diet, and the tumors did not come back. So that was really, really exciting to us. And this has all been published in 2012. You can get the paper and take a look at the data yourself if you'd like. So we started looking at this, and because of the work we did in cell culture, as well as in the animals, we started to realize that mechanistically, it's not just the glucose that's happening. We're not just starving these tumors. The ketones all by themselves are doing a huge amount. Some of the things that we've seen, and again, this has all been published, so you can just look up my name and you'll find these papers. We found, and others have found the same thing, that the ketogenic diet, in these animals, you get a reduction in edema or swelling around the tumor. We found that using MRI scans in the animals. It reduces the formation of new blood vessels in the tumors. That's important. If any of you have used some of the some of the anti-angiogenic therapies like bevacizumab or Avastin,
Yes,
sorry.
Avastin.
Bevacizumab is Avastin. If any of you have heard of Avastin, that is supposed to do this. Well, the ketogenic diet also does that. It reduces inflammation around the tumor. We found it increased the anti-tumor immune response, so it helps the immune system fight the tumor. And it does that partially, part of what it does for all of these things is it's reducing the signals that tell the tumor to grow. It reduces what's called hypoxia, which is reduced oxygen. Why is that important? Because areas of the tumor that are hypoxic or have hypoxia also tend to be more resistant to therapy. So if you reduce the hypoxia, you can hopefully help sensitize to therapy. And it also reduces the expression of a number of genes that are pro-cancer. So in other words, genes that are turned on that tell the cancer, let's get going, guys. This kind of slows that down. How does it do all of these things? Well, we think to a large extent it does it because of epigenetic modifications. Epigenetic modifications are changes in the genes that do not change the actual sequence of the genes. So it's not a mutation. It's just a way that our cells can change the way lots of genes at the same time are being used. And I don't have time to really go into that in a huge amount of detail, but epigenetic changes are very important. There are therapies now being tried to modify epigenetics and epigenetic changes in these tumors, and the ketone beta hydroxybutyrate has been shown to act as an epigenetic modifier. So that's the area of research that we're currently really pushing for. We've just submitted a paper that's showing some epigenetic changes that are happening due to ketones. In the clinic, there are currently 31 clinical trials that come up when you search for ketogenic diet and cancer, including 12 for brain tumors, 1 for pediatric brain tumors. These are all trials that are either in progress or they have been completed. I believe the pediatric brain tumor trial, I'm not sure if that's open yet, but I know it's listed on clinicaltrials.gov. So there's lots of interest in the ketogenic diet and cancer. The number of trials has been going up steadily. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that so far with the clinical trials that have been done, they're really not mature enough to comment on survival differences. What do I mean by that? There aren't enough patients that have gone through these trials that have been very compliant with the diet for which we have all the data we need, meaning did you make ketones? Did you drop glucose? We don't have enough data yet to see if it's going to make differences in survival. The diet is tolerable. There haven't been any major problems with people not being able to tolerate the diet. Sometimes side effects make chemotherapy or radiation intolerable. That hasn't been the case with this diet in general. No serious adverse effects, so no serious side effects that have been bad enough to say stop the diet, or at least if they're there, they're a tiny percentage. Some patients seem to do very well. Some teams seem to have average survival. But other things that have come up when studies have been done to look at quality of life is that when the patient is doing a ketogenic diet or in ketosis, it actually might reduce some of the side effects of therapies. It might enhance cognition, which is the thought process, and energy levels. I've had people say, when I was on the diet, I got off the sofa. I was feeling so much better. So there's a whole lot going on that's more than just length of survival. In our bias is that the best use would be in combination with other therapies. We don't think it should be used alone. We think it enhances other therapies. And then there's a lot of anecdotal information, and anecdotal doesn't mean wrong. It just means not proven by clinical trial. So the anecdotal data could very easily, and probably in many cases is, just as valid as data from a clinical trial. But so we think that there's lots of anecdotal data. There are some published reports that suggest that there probably is clinical efficacy, and we really, really need more work on this. So just to kind of summarize, we've learned that the ketogenic diet or fasting or caloric restriction are tolerable. When the patient is committed, that means the patient really has to want to do it. The dietitian or nutritionist support is absolutely critical. If somebody asks me, I always tell them, don't try this at home, folks. You got to get help. You got to have somebody who knows how to make this work properly to make sure your body is getting the nutrients it needs to fight the tumor and for the body to feel good. We also think that the physician agreeing is really important. This is not an easy thing to do. And if your physician is telling you, oh, I don't know if it's going to work, you're less likely to follow it. I know some physicians, in particular, one of the top neurosurgeons in the country for brain tumors, Dr. Chris Smith, He is an absolute proponent of it. He wants all his patients on it because he's really seen how good it is. And there's more and more clinicians that are starting to jump on that bandwagon. Ketogenic diet is not the only form of metabolic alteration that might work. Fasting, caloric restriction, there's a number of things that might be effective. We don't think that any one method is going to work in everybody. We don't know why yet. There's lots of genetic background in people that make people metabolize food differently. We didn't see major changes in quality of life in a very small sample of patients if they stay on the therapy. If it really made them feel terrible, then frankly, they just dropped off the diet. And more often than not, if they really felt bad enough that they wanted to drop off the diet, it was probably because they weren't contacting the dietitian often enough, because a lot of the issues could easily have been solved. We absolutely did not see any drop in cognition, so that was a good thing. And funding for controlled clinical trials is very critical and very, very difficult to get. We need to say that therapy is not just food. It is actually a therapy. It's following the instructions you're getting is just as important as following the instructions you get for taking a pill. Okay. Personalized medicine is a great thing. Let's figure out what works in different people, what works in different tumors. You can do exactly the same types of studies when you're talking about metabolic therapy. So that would be very, very useful to try to predict what patients might respond. Different diets can be similar, but they're not identical. So how would these differences possibly have different effects in the tumors? These are all things we want to look at. We need a registry for anecdotal patient data. We've talked about this for a long time. We're working on it slowly. It's a little more difficult than you might imagine. There's lots of challenges because people are doing very variable things. It has to be HIPAA compliant, patient reports versus healthcare professionals, but it is something we need to do. And then we'd love to find what we call biomarkers. So we know we can look at blood glucose and ketones. It'd be really cool if we could come up with imaging types of ways to follow this, metabolic markers, various things. And there's a number of people that are actually trying to find those sorts of things. So my take-home message, I know I've said that 3 times, is that we think nutritional ketosis is really good for lots and lots of things in terms of fighting cancer. We know it's safe. We know it increases the efficacy of standard cancer therapies preclinically, and in some clinical reports, it's got so many mechanisms of action that we think it's going to actually help with lots of different therapies. And it's actually pretty cool that I think pretty much any cancer patient could try it. There are a couple of cancers, possibly not, but for the most part, I think it could be useful. These are the people in my laboratory who have done the work, my collaborators who have done the work, acknowledgements for some of the funding we've received. And now I am thrilled to introduce my colleague and very good friend and fabulous dietitian, Leonora Renda. So now she's going to talk and tell you about implementation of the ketogenic diet.
Thank you, Adrienne. Adrienne's a great researcher to work with. She's really supportive of everything that we do in nutrition, and we appreciate that. And I'm going to talk about implementation to this diet. I'm going to talk a little bit about basic nutrition. This is called the social ecological model. And as you look at it, we have to touch each individual sphere to actually start making a difference in changing anybody's diet or anybody's lifestyle. So everybody knows how to eat well, but maybe the family isn't supportive, or where you work, you don't have options to have healthy nutrition. Maybe the laws are keeping you from going forward. So we know just to change your diet, each one of these areas have to be touched. And here's some of the barriers to change. We know that people want to change, but they fail to do so, maybe because they don't have time or they're stressed. Lack of motivation, depression, finances can be an issue, maybe not access to healthy food, the cognitive ability to do it, and the lack of support. And we know right away that education alone is not sufficient enough to change anybody's eating habit. So what we do know what works are a series of interventions, sometimes telephone follow-ups from the dietitian, videos that the patients can watch. With metabolic, we always did contracts where the patient signed a contract that they would follow that diet. Nutritional tools such as MyFitnessPal or those kind of things that you can get on the internet or on your phone. And then multiple interventions. So if we take a look at several interventions, and we look at things that we know that we need to do those to make a difference for anybody. So when we look at cancer and we look at nutrition, we look at several areas: cancer prevention, cancer treatment, and cancer survivorship. So we know that there's going to be research across all of those areas, and that's really important. We're going to see multiple nutrition interventions there, but we know that we need to have more research. So as we look at that, when we say when you look at prevention, survivorship, it's a healthy diet. When we're treating for cancer, we know it's to side effects. And then these would be the goals that we would look at for our cancer patients: actual optimal calories, protein, and other nutrients. We try to improve their tolerance to treatment with their nutrition. We minimize lean body mass loss. So we want to keep their muscles strong. We want to make sure that the patient achieves and maintains an optimal body weight. And we want to enhance the quality of life. We don't want people to lose weight or to lose muscle and to lose strength. That becomes important. This is what happens to the patients. Our patients will be going along on a regular life, leading a regular life, and all of a sudden they had some kind of neurological change. It could be a stroke, it could be problems seeing, maybe a seizure, maybe there's some problems with personality changes, and sometimes it could just be nausea, headache, or vomiting. But they go to the doctor or they go to the emergency ward and they see that. And as we look at that, they are scanned and they discover they have a tumor. They're within days they're in surgery, within weeks they're in treatment, and their entire life is turned upside down. We do know with the keto diet that it's been used for seizure disorders since the 1920s. We know that patients are 15 to 45% of those patients have inoperable or medication-resistant epilepsy. The KD is administered under the care of a neurologist and a dietitian. Pre-lab evaluation first. We know that it's used across the world, in Asia, in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, just everywhere with different cultures and different food styles. Well, when we look at it, we know that we're switching your energy source from glucose to fat, and the fat breaks down to ketones, and then the body is able to use those ketones. The way you measure it can be either in urine or in the blood. You'll see it spill over into the urine and measured in the blood. The diet, as Dr. Scheck said, is a ratio of fat to combined carbohydrate and protein. The classic ketogenic diet is really individualized for the family with a meal plan based on the calorie requirements and the protein requirements of the patients. There's special meal plans and recipes that are provided. The food can be measured in grams, and the meal should be eaten in its entirety so you have the fat. And we really look at that management also to include a medical food. We have flours, we have shakes, we have food that's coming out that's with those ratios. So as you look at that, we can use those to really go forward. This is what a typical diet looks like. So if you look at it, you can see carbohydrate, your fat, and your protein. But in a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet, this is all of your fat, there's your protein, and there's your carb. So you can see that that's really very, very restrictive when we look at the carbohydrates and the protein versus our typical diet that we look at. So when we talk about keto diet, there's several of them. There's the classic or the modified ketogenic diet, modified Atkins, which is a less restringent diet, MCT oil diet, which adds MCT to the meals to bring up the fat content. And then we're starting to see more pre-made meals or pre-made foods coming out. So when I go to start the keto diet with a patient, we usually try to, especially brain cancer patient, we start the diet prior to treatment so they can be in ketosis. I look at a baseline lipid panel to see where they are with their fats, cholesterol, triglycerides. We start on preventive steps for constipation and nausea. We want them to drink lots of water. Patients have to drink about 1 gallon of water. I usually put them on Miralax, which is a laxative. And then we also, for nausea, we do baking soda mixed with water, probably about 1/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda with 4 to 6 ounces of water 4 times a day, and that really helps with the nausea. The patients need to keep a daily record of their glucose and ketones levels. The glucose is going to be very low, between 70 and 80, and we want the ketones, the blood ketones, at 3 or above, and the uric ketones at 40 or above. And we ask them to track their daily intake, and they can use applications to do that so they can see how much of each of the macronutrients that they're eating. I usually reduce their calories to their resting energy expenditure to burn off any stored glucose in their body, and I limit the carbohydrates to 10 to 20 grams a day. And then after they achieve ketosis, I liberalize the diet to their total energy equation that they need, and then I make sure that their protein needs are met. So that's one of the most important things, protein, because of the lean body mass and muscle. This would be a sample recipe for a menu, excuse me, for a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet. So you can see it's calculated in grams, and you want to make sure at the end of the day, you see how my net carbs are low. Here's my protein, and here's my fat. And this technically would not meet like the protein levels that we need for a patient. We do know that the side effects from the keto diet are, of course, not enough vitamins and minerals, so a multivitamin should be taken. You could have high cholesterol. If you do, we then just switch the diet away from saturated fats to more healthy fats. We use Miralax for constipation. With weight loss, I will increase calories to make sure that in the ratio of the diet to ensure that they do not lose weight. Kidney stones, again, drinking that gallon of water prevents kidney stones because that is a side effect, and the upset stomach. And here we talk about what we would do with the soda and the baking water to help relieve that. Sometimes this is called the keto flu. Here is another recipe that is used from one of the websites. It talks about a spicy crock-pot double beef stew recipe. I like that because the cancer patients are usually really busy going to radiation 5 times a week and then with chemotherapy, and this is something nice and easy that they could use and have ready at home. And it just talks about the way to do it. Here's the net carbs and the calories, and so you can kind of see how that fits all in, and there's the website that I received that from. This would be good for maybe a 2-to-1 diet as you look at it. So how do you measure your ketos? You can purchase a glucose ketone meter to take your blood ketone levels and glucose levels. However, the ketone levels are very expensive. The glucose levels are inexpensive. The meter is about $25 to $35, so not overly expensive. Here's where you would want them to be with the ratios. Sometimes if you can't afford the ketone strips, urine strips may be met. You actually dip it in the urine, and then the color of the strip turns to indicate where you are. This is used a lot in pediatric epilepsy. But both of these are good. Usually I say do this during the week and then do your ketone strips once a week if you're unable to afford the strips. Here's some questions from comments from some of the patients that I've worked with. My battle with brain cancer through surgery and radiation is going a lot faster and a lot better than my doctors have ever seen. So their battle, that they don't seem to have as much. Through focusing on a diet, the patient could help themselves, which is really good, the patient and the family. It makes them feel like they have some type of buy-in to the treatment, and they can actually work on it themselves. Talking daily to the dietitian helps the patient feel connected with the treatment. I usually make sure that my patient can text me or call me anytime. If they're in the grocery store, they can go ahead and take a picture of the label and send it to me via text and see if that product is available for them and that makes sense for them. So that's one way that I kind of work with them with their diet. And some of the families had friends and family provide family meals with the evening meals so that patient could focus on her meals. And that's extremely helpful because if you have a family with young children, you're actually preparing 2 meals. And this helps with somebody's able to do 1 meal for you, and then you could just focus on your own treatment to make sure that you're following the diet as needed. So to me, I think that was one of the really important takeaways from this. Here are some of the comments that I had from the patients. I'm a little concerned about my weight. In cancer treatment, the physicians are very concerned with loss of lean body mass. With cancer, usually cachexia happens. Not so much in brain cancer, but in other cancers it could. So the doctors always get concerned when the patient starts to lose weight. So what we'll do is talk about ways to keep their weight. One thing I'll tell patients if they talk about this and they're full, what I tell them is to, divide up their meals into small meals throughout the day, keeping the same ketone ratio to make sure that they can maintain ketosis. I have a lot of patients that ask if we're getting any prepackaged meals. One of my patients had limited use of her hand, and it was difficult to cook. Sometimes with brain cancers, it can affect the other things that the patient can do. So this patient had a problem with her hand. So she was looking for a nice, simple, easy way to move forward. Now in the stores, you'll start to see a lot of ketone foods that can work. And usually I'll say to someone, if it isn't the right ketone food, to buy the entree and then fill in the rest of their meal to make sure that they maintain the fat content that they need. One patient's family was concerned about Thanksgiving. We had it all figured out of what the patient could have, the turkey and spaghetti squash, which is low in carbohydrates. But she wanted to make some kind of a cranberry sauce with berries for them. And that recipe would have to be changed to make sure that it was it was using some type of sugar substitute. I like liquid stevia a lot, and that could have been used to cook the homemade cranberry sauce with berries, and the patient could have had a small amount fitting in with their carbohydrate piece for that. Of course, as Dr. Scheck said, everybody knows that the internet is very informative. One of my patients asked, that said that her cousin told her that the carbs in quinoa are processed like a vegetable, not a sugar. Can I substitute it for cream? And the answer is no. A carb is a carb, and it's going to be found in a grain. It doesn't process as a vegetable. It does break down into sugar. I think that's one of the confusing things, especially with what the internet says. Usually I'll tell patients to eliminate carbs unless they're less than 1 gram of carb a day, and go with that area instead of trying to make something fit in that really doesn't fit in. One of my patients had a hard time getting the 3rd meal in a day. So what would we do? We talked about using a snack instead if that patient wanted to. So we looked at a popcorn with lots of butter. The popcorn is very high in fiber, low in net carbs, and that was a good way for them to incorporate that into their meal and have that. We always have patients that ask, are there meds that are used to induce or maintain ketosis? And the answer is no, really the diet is the best way. As Dr. Scheck said, fasting is a good way to do that. Intermittent fasting might work, and a reduction in calories might work. But, in treatment, again, that reduction in calories probably would not be something the physician would want you to do. So here are the barriers to to people really actually being able to implement the keto diet. There is a huge lack of support in the medical community. As Dr. Scheck said, we have limited trials, and we're really working to get more of a controlled trial in place. If you look at cancer trials, usually they are very controlled. It's very difficult to control a diet and what the patient eats. And I think that makes it a little more difficult to start moving forward with those trials. I think that it's really important. As Dr. Scheck said, there's lots of different trials. There's some where people have tracked exactly what they've eaten. There's some where people have given guidelines of what they've eaten, and it has to be very, very individualized. That leads to the next one, which is a limited number of cancer keto dietitians. And there really are. We have dietitians that are really good in the keto diet that work with epilepsy, and dietitians that are really good that work with cancer. But that crossover has to happen for people to really understand this diet. And I do get a lot of emails from dietitians asking questions about how the cancer keto diet works. What we also find in the community is a lack of cooking skills. It seems like in our fast-paced culture, we tend to go out and just buy things pre-made or go out to restaurants, and that's a really lack of cooking skills. And that makes it a little bit more difficult. Changing existing habits is harder than adapting new habits. And it's very hard to change the diet that you've grown up on and then try to really go over to a brand new diet when it's a little more difficult to do and a little more difficult to find in our community. The lack of a variety of pre-made meals is also a big issue. We want to make sure that that's out there for those patients that need that, that don't have the time or they're depressed or stress gets in the way with them of actually making their meals. I will say I did have one patient's church that came together every Sunday and met at his home and made all the meals for the week. And then he was able to refrigerate them or freeze them. So there are other ways we can do to kind of support that family. Depression is a huge issue. And if you even start talking about just changing your diet, think about having cancer that leads to some depression. And then that just compounds if you're looking at cancer and keto. Lack of funds and lack of support at home. I had one patient that I went to work with, and I had to teach him how to take his own blood sugar, and we were talking about just implementation of the diet. And his wife at that time said, "I'm not going to help you." And that really led to the person falling off the diet. Time pressures become really important. Just in everyday life, but now you're going to radiation for 5 days for a certain time. That changes everything. And so you kind of look at that. With brain cancer, also cognitive ability can be an issue too. So a barrier to both keto and a barrier just to change your diet would be the cognitive ability to do so. So as we look at that, those are all things that kind of cross over through both. And so those are just some things that we would take a look at. And then here are my references.
You can go last.
Okay. Now it's time for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Scheck and Ms. Renda. We will now take questions from our attendees. If you have a question you would like to ask, please type and submit it using the question box in your webinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. So our first question is about, you made a great point that people should not try to do this diet at home. But some people are wondering how the ketogenic diet might compare to other diets that are low sugar, high fat, and things that might be similar to the ketogenic diet. One person mentioned the Weight Watchers program in particular. Do you have any feedback about that?
I do like the Weight Watchers program for weight loss. I wouldn't use it for cancer treatment because they're much focused on what USDA says what a healthy diet would look like, which is half your plate fruits and vegetables, 1/4 grains, and 1/4 proteins. When you start looking at a therapeutic diet, you would cut down immensely the number of grains that you have a day because they're extremely high in carbohydrate. So, and then your fruits and vegetables would vary. We'd keep away from the starchy vegetables like potatoes, corn, green peas, winter squash, because those all are really compared to a grain. So those would be very limited too. So it's actually tailored to you based on your weight, your height, and your age. And then we come up with your exact energy requirements, and then we put those into the diet for you, based on whether it's a 2-to-1 or a 4-to-1 diet.
Thank you. We've of course been talking a lot about cancers and malignant tumors. Dr. Scheck or Ms. Renda, have you heard anything about this diet being used for any types of non-malignant tumors?
Yes.
I know there are people talking about it. So yes, we've heard about people wanting to do it. I believe there are probably some people doing it. There's not really a clinical trial for benign tumors. One of the issues with clinical trials is when it comes to something that is very, very slow growing or benign, it can be really hard to parse out whether something is making a change or whether it's just the nature of that diet. But there are people interested in it. In terms of brain tumors, so patients with low-grade tumors who have a longer life expectancy, certainly, than patients with the high-grade malignant tumors, some of the reasons people at that level have spoken about using a ketogenic diet is totally for symptom control. So if a patient with a low-grade tumor, they're prone to have more prone to have seizures sometimes than high-grade tumors. So some of the patients, I know in the UK, they were talking about starting a trial with low-grade patients where really the focus was reduction of seizures and being able to use lower doses of anti-seizure meds, for example, if you could reduce seizures. So under those circumstances, it wouldn't be necessarily tumor growth as much as symptoms. But I think both Lee and I have heard of people that want to do that.
I actually worked with one person whose young daughter had benign tumor, and she is on the diet and follows the diet. Again, that's just anecdotal at this point in time. There's no research behind it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any particular considerations that are taken into account when comparing the ketogenic diet between pediatric patients and adult patients?
Yes, there is. If we look at the pediatric patients, they are still in the growth mode. They're still growing. So what happens is you have to really check them as they continue to grow. You have to make sure you're meeting their energy requirements and their protein requirements as they grow. So it's a little more focused and a little more controlled with that. So you kind of follow it that way to make sure that it's okay. And the protein becomes really important because they are growing at that point in time. So it would still be a 4-to-1. Your energy requirements are just going to change more frequently as you go forward.
And it is being used by people for pediatric cancers. So for example, there are 3 foundations for any listener that might want some additional information. The Max Love Project is a really wonderful foundation they're out there, they're on Facebook, and they're definitely doing a lot of ketogenic diet, but also other complementary things. And then the 2 main foundations for the ketogenic diet would be the Charlie Foundation in the United States. And they started looking at it for epilepsy because Charlie was the person's son that had this intractable epilepsy. He's now an adult. But they've actually expanded their foundation to include brain tumors and other diseases that might be helped by that. And then in the UK, there's Matthew's Friends. And both of these foundations have wonderful websites with lots of good information, lots of good recipes, things like that. So those are 3 websites that I would suggest that people might want to take a look at.
And the research that I looked on pediatrics, they usually do a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet. That's what I've seen in most studies. 4-to-1 is 4 fats to 1 carb plus protein. So it would be that pie chart with the 90% fat. That's the one that the pediatric patients are on, and that's the one that the cancer patient Hallmark study used too.
Thank you. And a lot of people are asking about considerations for those who may be vegetarian or vegan. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, absolutely. I do. I've worked with several patients that are vegetarian. It becomes a little more difficult. I would encourage them to do things like eggs because that's a good way to get protein in. And then we work together to see what their diet looks like and then make sure that the protein sources that they're choosing, the plant protein sources that they're choosing are not going to be plant-based, carbohydrate, have a lot of carbohydrates in them. So we really kind of work to make that work. But I've worked with a lot of patients that are vegetarian, and it can be a little more difficult, but that's why you need to work with a registered dietitian because she'll help guide you, or he will help guide you through that process to do that. I've become extremely close to a lot of our patients because we may correspond daily or weekly or whenever that they need to have that. So we kind of look at it that way. So yes, I have. It is more difficult though.
And speaking of working with a dietitian, do you have any recommendations for people who want to look for a dietitian to work with?
Lee is fantastic. Actually, the nice thing about working with a dietitian, and this is coming from somebody who people contact me and the first thing I say is, I can't help you with this, you got to go to somebody who knows what they're doing, is you actually don't have to have them in your same city or anything else like that. A lot of possibly all of the communication can easily be online, by phone, etc. So whether or not you have a dietitian that's local to you really doesn't matter. Like I said, Lee is an awesome, she has a consulting firm. I have a list of other consultants if somebody wants to look at things that are closer to home. There is a list of dietitians on the Charlie Foundation site, and they all really know they all know the ketogenic diet very well. And I would say if you wanted to look for someone more local, you could go to lists like that, and then you can simply ask them, have they worked with cancer patients?
And I also get emails from other dietitians in cancer centers who have questions about this, and I will work with them and help guide them as we do that. So I can be a reference also.
Thank you. One of our listeners shared with us that he had read and been informed by several physicians that a tumor, regardless of a diet that someone is on, is going to get the sugar that it needs to survive, and that by depriving the body of sugar, it means that the brain will not get the sugar that it needs. Can you speak to this topic at all?
Okay. Yes, the tumor will suck up as much sugar as it can find, anything it can find. Does it matter if you reduce sugar? I believe it does. The reason I say that is because there have been numerous studies especially in cancers like breast cancer, where, and there have been, I believe there's been some in brain tumors also, patients that are hyperglycemic, in other words, have high blood sugar, they don't do as well. Bottom line, if a patient has high blood sugar, they are not going to do as well. If they have lower blood sugar, they will do well. Can you starve the tumor all by itself? Probably not. The tumor will find sources of glucose, and some tumors can actually use other things other than just glucose for growth, like glutamine. However, one of the things that we've been doing in our research, again, it's preclinical, but still I think it says a lot, is that it's not just the sugar that's important. It is the ketones also. And in fact, Dr. Dom D'Agostino, or actually Dr. Angela Poff, working with Dom, have also looked at exogenous ketones. In other words, just get the ketone as a chemical and add it to cells, and can you see a difference, or add it to the animal, can you see a difference? And they are seeing some differences. So I think it's more than just glucose when you talk about a ketogenic diet. I think that's a really, really important thing for people to remember. And there are also studies that are showing in people that short-term fasting before some of the therapies is absolutely reducing side effects. So there's definitely things going on that are outside of the changes in glucose.
And I'll speak to that from a dietitian's point of view, because we've worked with the pediatric epilepsy population in special needs. And those patients are put on a ketogenic diet, a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet, to reduce the seizures. And they remain on that diet for 2 years, and they continue to grow well. They don't have issues with cognitive issues. They maintain their growth chart. So it works. And I don't think doctors get a whole lot of education about nutrition.
Very little.
So if you take a look at glucose and ketones, we know that the body can survive on ketones. If you think about the hunter-gatherer piece of this, when you had food, they ate. And when you didn't have food, they burned their fat because they were starving. So because they could not get food. So our body is absolutely amazing because it can work on both of those fuels. So it's that's a little incorrect what that physician said, and I think he needs to go back and really look at what nutrition means, what the metabolic piece of this means, because it does work.
Yeah. In addition, the brain will actually preferentially use ketones. The brain loves using ketones for energy. There's been some very elegant work by a scientist named Dr. Stephen Cunnane, I believe it's C-U-N-N-A-N-E, where he's doing PET scans, positron emission tomography, and he can actually show glucose utilization in brain and ketone utilization in brain. And the normal brain is very happy on ketones.
So I believe that the evidence is there that it doesn't affect a patient cognitively, and the patient still can maintain their weight. Or in the instance of a pediatric patient, they can continue to grow following their growth curve.
Great, thank you. We only have time for one more question. The last question is, if someone wants to learn more about the ketogenic diet, what are some good resources, some good evidence-based resources that people can look at to educate themselves about it?
Well, I think what Dr. Scheck said, to take a look at the Charlie Foundation and that Matthew's Friends, they have research listed on there. But if you would do a search about pediatric epilepsy and the ketogenic diet, it would come up with information regarding that. And if you really have more questions, actually talking to a dietitian is the right way to go. I mean, they're fine to contact me, and I could send research information regarding that to them.
If they would like to sort of slog through some of the scientific papers, I would say they can go onto a website called NCBI, that stands for the National Center for Biotechnology Information or something like that. But anyway, NCBI, or just look up something called PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D, and it'll come up with a search, and you can put the words ketones, ketogenic diet, cancer, and you will come up with all the scientific papers that have been published. A lot of those papers, for example, the papers we've published are what's called open access, which means anybody can download them and read them. There's also quite a few webinars. So the Charlie Foundation and Matthew's Friends have both sponsors. There's a major global ketogenic diet meeting, and it flips back and forth between Europe and the US, and the talks are recorded and put up on YouTube. So you can actually probably go on YouTube and you can download scientific talks that people have given that you could actually find out more that way.
Yeah, and there is a consensus statement that I know the Charlie Foundation with other groups put out about the ketogenic diet, specifically for pediatric epilepsy, but that would be a way just to learn a little bit more about the diet.
Wonderful. That's all the time we have today. Thank you all for joining us. And once again, thank you to Dr. Scheck and Ms. Renda for their wonderful webinar presentation. Aside from the ABTA's free educational webinar series, we have a variety of programs available to help connect patients and caregivers with information and resources and support them on their brain tumor journey. We also have resources for healthcare professionals as well. For more information, visit the ABTA website at abta.org or call us at 800-886-2282. This concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us, and please be sure to complete the evaluation survey you will receive by email within the next 2 days. You may now disconnect.